It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I'm still in my pajamas. Let's talk about Assassin's Creed Syndicate. The final City Assassin's Creed game, at least for now. And I can kind of see why. I like Assassin's Creed, I don't love it, and I think a lot of people share a similar sentiment. And when there was so many games year after year following the same formula, yeah, this didn't exactly shake it up in a huge way, though there's still a lot of interesting stuff to discuss, particularly because they took a year out, and then we just haven't seen a traditional city-style Assassin's Creed since then. You know, it's just completely fallen off the map. Speaking of which, I actually really like London in this game. This is one of the things that stood out to me most while I was playing it. I mean, you have shopkeepers on the streets, people hawking, things like that, kids playing with each other, kicking balls about. People are doing different things. There's beggars, there's rich people. You can see a difference in all the districts. You go over to Westminster and suddenly it's all high market and they're all speaking in posh accents and they've got their top hats and suits, and it even feels like the streets are cleaner and more colourful. There's definitely a feeling of they're trying to capture the London smog, and as a result the game sort of looks a bit beige, a bit brown. It reminds me a lot of the sort of Xbox 360 PS3 era of games where that was kind of the cool style. But I get that it's trying to capture the smog, and in a sense of like the Thames, oh yeah, I mean that looks realistic. It's brown. It is not a clean river, but even when you go to the richer areas, because they're still trying to get that feeling of industrial London, it lacks a bit of colour, and I think it's not just that. I think it's that the game looks a bit washed out, because I ran Reshade on it, and you can actually see just by pressing a button that it hasn't impacted the style significantly, but oh my god, it looks so much better, so much clearer. It doesn't look so fuzzy, and it has the contrast that it needs. It's particularly interesting because Unity also tries to capture that make the city look dirty type thing. But because there was a lot of interiors in that game, and those interiors were used to show the separation between the rich and the poor by having the outsides being the sort of brown colours, and then indoors being gold leaf and red trimmings on everything. You really got a bit of variety in the visual style, but you also, like I said, it demonstrates that theme. Now, because Syndicate has fewer interiors, this isn't pulled off quite as well, and the whole game ends up feeling a bit like an overly dramatic rendition of what people think Victorian London looked like. And I mean, to be fair, it wasn't a particularly cleanly? It's a particularly cleanly place, yes. But even then, I feel like some liberties could have been taken to make this pop a little more. This just bothers me because I really love the portrayal of cities in Assassin's Creed games. I think the one thing the franchise nails is presentation. I actually have some notes in here. I'm working with paper notes, which I never usually do, and it means that you're going to be hearing me doing this a lot. Yeah, no, I can't find it, but I think Assassin's Creed games are as much about telling the story of the city as it is the characters within it. And not to sound too pretentious with that, but they really do go an extra mile to, for example, make the architecture look absolutely stunning. It always looks great. It's a shame because the actual story of the characters is kind of mediocre. Now, I get what they were going for. There's a lot of very moody, very overly serious protagonists in Assassin's Creed games, and this basically consists of the two main characters, Jacob and Evie Fry, just sort of going, hey, we're not doing much good here, let's go to London, and literally jumping on a train to London in the same cutscene. There is no pretense of this being a particularly serious story, and strangely devoid of the themes of family that seem to run through most of these games. I mean, Assassin's Creed tends to dissolve into, oh, you killed X family member, therefore I need to kill a bunch of Templars. This one, the only family link is the fact that Jacob and Evie are brother and sister, and that isn't really used for anything, because most of the missions, they're completely separate. You know, there's this idea that they have different approaches, different styles. Evie's like has read the assassin texts and wears the assassin outfit and does all these things, and then Jacob's like a ruffian, you know, going and brawling and beating people up and making his gang. But really, in a gameplay capacity as well, there isn't much of a difference. You've got these skill trees for each of the characters, but the skill trees are identical. The only difference is that like 2 or 3 skills at the very end of them are exclusive to certain characters, and you don't really get those until the very end of the game. I don't really like the idea of a skill tree in Assassin's Creed. I think it's a bit redundant. It's part of a bigger problem with the slow creep of RPG features that I will get into. I actually do like some of these ideas. One of my favourite moves is this. So when you're doing combat, you get enemies into a stun state and then you can do an execution on them. If you set up multiple enemies into that state, you do like a cool multi-kill where there's like a different camera angle and they chain attacks between the enemies, and like if you're playing Evie with a cane, she'll like use the cane sheath as one of the things and like stab it into somebody, kill someone else and come back and pick it up. That's really cool, and there's a mechanic from the skill tree for Jacob where if you get multi-kills, I think it's just Jacob, if you get multi-kills, then for each kill you get in that sequence, you get some health back. The problem is you get that at the very, very end of the game, and you never get a chance to use it or build your sort of gameplay style around it. The skill tree doesn't change up how you play significantly, and as a result it just feels like a formality. Evie also has like this invisibility move and stealth that you just don't use because by the time you get it, it's so late that they can't design the game around the idea that you might be invisible when you're standing still, because most people won't be at that point. I think the RPG features, I mean, we could see where that would lead with Odyssey and Origins, but as somebody who's not a particularly huge fan of RPG systems, in a general sense, I guess, as opposed to specific examples, this specific example is sort of unnecessary. Assassin's Creed, one of the big problems in the series was always that the combat and the gameplay was quite easy. You get into the flow of it and then everything becomes trivial. This was particularly bad in like Assassin's Creed 3 and 4, where combat was just exceedingly easy, especially in the second half. Their approach to this in Unity, to solve this problem, the developers, was to create a sort of light leveling system where you can get new equipment that makes you more powerful, and enemies have a certain rank based on their difficulty. Now, I quite liked how Unity did feel a little more challenging, but it was true that you couldn't really enter an area with significantly more powerful enemies because you would get destroyed. Syndicate is even more indicative of that problem because now the leveling system is numbers based, so gear has a number, enemies have a number, you have a number, everything is numbered, and if you approach an area where they're 1 or 2 levels above you in the early game, you're gonna get killed in like 1 or 2 hits, you're just gonna get stun locked into submission. Strangely enough, as you progress through the game, you unlock tools and equipment and things like that, and you learn how the combat works, and you adapt to it, and as a result, you can waltz into like level 9 areas, level 5, and just sort of destroy them if you know what you're doing, which could be argued as, hey, look, you know, it's requiring players to be creative and unique, but in reality, it's because the combat isn't any more difficult at the higher levels. All you're doing is cranking up the amount of damage that enemies are dealing, and that's really silly. We haven't moved beyond these are the heavy enemies, these are the light enemies, and here's like the special one who like counters you more often. That being said, the combat gets closer and closer to what it should be in Assassin's Creed. It's such a far cry from Unity, where they slowed it down significantly and it was all about flourishes with your blade and doing heavy swings. This is incredibly fast and frenetic and quite cartoony. You know, enemies will go flying back. One of the problems I have is that the health of enemies is quite significant. So you're doing these huge punches and they're flying back against the wall, and then they don't lose a lot of health. So you just keep punching them, they keep hitting the wall and stumbling, and that just continues for like 5 minutes, and that's your combat. I do like once again, the presentation is great. The execution is lacking. And once more, you do have these sort of assassinations you can pull on specific enemies in the game. And they have improved this in small ways. So instead of them all sort of blurring into each other and just being, oh, you kill this guy in some random location and that's it, they're playing harder and harder into the idea that you're at the Bank of England, you're at Westminster, you're at this place, you're at that place doing it, which does make it a little more dramatic. And they also introduce this idea that there's like opportunities, so like you free a guard and then his guards will help you out, or you can take this disguise and get a unique assassination. The problem is that these are just preferable to just a basic assassination. They're easier, in fact. And there's no reason not to do them, there's no decision making in it. This is purely a visual flair in some sense. Assassinations aren't just the name of the game though, because off the top of my head, you've got carriage combat. You can free like kids from like workhouses. And same difference really, it's Victorian London. Everything was a poor house. You can like hunt down specific Templars, and there's ones where you have to kidnap them and then lead them out of an area without the others detecting them. Now it's particularly weird that enemies can see you from quite a distance, but if you're carrying someone with their arm pulled behind their back, suddenly you're not conspicuous. But there's a lot of additional little bits of variety, and while the base gameplay is hardly that distinct from, say, Unity, it does keep things interesting, or at least more interesting than, say, the problem in Assassin's Creed 1, where it was just assassinate this guy, assassinate this guy, assassinate this guy. As for new additions, I mean, the big thing, in my opinion, they were talking a lot in marketing about the carriages and the trains and all that, but really the big addition is the zipline. You can like fire it across rooftops to avoid having to run down this building, run across the street and climb up the next one. And now the zipline is about as fast as just running, let alone the fact that if you wanted to run across the street, you would have to climb down and climb back up. The zipline becomes quite dominant in how you progress through the city, and the problem is Assassin's Creed has a serious problem with automation of its movement. You hold the right trigger and you run at a wall, you know what I mean? The difference now is you're pressing a button and then you're just holding forwards, and suddenly you're across those rooftops. And in many ways, it is the fastest way to traverse rooftops. And I guess it kind of makes sense why the rooftops would be a little simpler than Unity. Unity had wonderful, wonderful parkour. I actually really liked it, aside from the automation aspect of it. It could be a little more involved. The parkour up-down system, though, made a huge change in actually making conscious decisions while running, instead of just holding the trigger and expecting blind faith, and then leaping off an edge and falling to your death. That rarely happened in Unity, and it never happened in Syndicate. And they really fixed what was a significant problem with the movement in previous Assassin's Creed games. And the parkour up-down system is why that is the case. If you're not pressing parkour down, they're not gonna jump down. Similarly, you can approach short obstacles in Unity, and if you hold parkour up, then they will jump on top of it. If you hold parkour down, they will vault over it and keep running. Now that's a really nice touch, and it is still there in Syndicate, but it feels like the things that you interact with on the rooftops and on the ground have less diversity. And as a result, you're either approaching objects where it will automatically decide to vault over for you, or ones where it's slightly too high or slightly too low for a choice to make any difference. It's such a strange change, and I think it's only because the emphasis was, ironically for Assassin's Creed, it's such a staple, emphasis was taken away from parkour and towards the zipline. This is a result of, I think, the fact that it's Victorian London. You have these wide streets and you have these buildings that are pretty uniform, and unlike Unity, where it feels more and more like a old sprawling city where there's been no planning or design, which is also fair to attribute to London, to be honest, it did feel like you were scrambling across sort of diverse different rooftops that were mismatched and misaligned, whereas in Syndicate, oh, I need to reach that other street, that other building. Well, it's across the street, and there is clearly not enough room to pass several carriage widths worth of road in order to get across. So the zipline becomes the default. And it's fine, but I feel like the compromise to introduce carriages wasn't worth it, because carriages are incredibly primitive. You've got like a ramming mechanic, you can jump on the top to fight enemies, which is cool if it wasn't so janky, and most importantly, you can't easily transition movement between moving objects in the game and stationary ones. Now this was a problem with ships in like Assassin's Creed 4 and things like that, where if you wanted to get off a ship in Assassin's Creed 4, you were either having to jump off of it onto solid land when the ship isn't moving, jumping from the plank off the edge, into water, which is an open body, instead of trying to align with a certain object, or grabbing onto like a rope and swing across to, say, another ship or something, which usually only applied when they were stationary. There wasn't much of boarding ships while they were moving, because I don't think the game could really deal with the idea that not only are you trying to move between two stationary objects, which if you've tried the parkour in Assassin's Creed game, you realise even that's a challenge for the game, but also one that's moving relative to the other, which, I mean, the calculations of that must be hellish, must be horrible. And it does manage this at times in Syndicate, where you're jumping from a train to a wall, or you're jumping from a carriage to a building side, but it is so infrequent, mostly because I think there's a very limited selection of interactables and distances and heights and things like that that you can move from a moving object. I mean, hell, on the carriages, if you're standing on top of a carriage and you want to get off, the only way to do it is to hijack it, kick off the person who's driving it, get in the seat, and then get out so you can do a pre-scripted animation. Like, that is baffling. That's crazy. You can't even zipline off of... I thought the zipline would be a great solution to that. You fire a zipline at a point, then it just continues while you're moving, you jump, and then it just snaps you to whatever wall it pulls you towards. Now, that's because there's really no swinging systems. That would be quite a bit more complicated, but it's just an idea of what they could have done to solve this issue of moving between stationary and objects in motion. Stealth is once more quite easily abusable. I did find it interesting that we seem to have moved away from a lot of Assassin's Creed staples. Like, very rarely did I find myself blending into crowds. I only realised when I was getting some footage today that you can still sit on a bench to blend in, because that comes up so rarely. There's not many vantage points, really. And Eagle Vision is just so broken now, where it's become more of a crutch than previous games. So when you're approaching stealth, you use Eagle Vision, you target everybody in the area, you get their little numbers to tell you what level they're at, and then once more, stealth kills are a one-hit kill. The system's very, very similar to previous games. A lot of the animations are very similar, if not the same. The new additions just sort of complicate matters further, because you've got more. Like, guns naturally became more powerful as humanity progressed, and since I think Assassin's Creed 3, this has become more and more of an issue, where it's so easy to just passively go, bang, you're dead, okay, that's the objective done. Now, this is actually worsened by an older technology, which is throwing knives. You can throw knives and instantly kill most enemies with a headshot, which is cool. I like that. I like the idea of being able to rapidly, like, chuck out some throwing knives and just watch people fall, but when you're approaching a certain district, and there is a target inside, say, a square that you need to kill, and they're surrounded by enemies and lookouts, you can climb onto a rooftop, aim down at their head, throw a throwing knife, immediately kill them, and walk away with nobody knowing the wiser, which in a way reminds me a lot of like Watch Dogs 2, where you could just chuck in drones and have people fight each other and bring in gangs to fight the security and all that, and without even stepping foot in the area, kill your target or clear the area that you're going for. The difference is Watch Dogs 2, there was a lot more variety to that. It felt a lot more like you were having to push the limits to try and break the systems that they'd so finely crafted. And that was kind of enjoyable in a strange way. I really enjoyed that in Watch Dogs 2. It was the most fun way of dealing with, like, camps and enemies. But when it comes down to just, oh, throw a knife at them, now they're dead, now you walk away. It's funny the first few times, but then it just becomes routine. The stealth is one of those things that just didn't really age well with the franchise, particularly when you're introducing new mechanics and systems to make people more powerful. I mean, at this point you've got assassins that are jumping onto carriages, running people over and causing extreme property damage. It's come so far from, oh, you wear the hood because you're blending in with these monks, to you wear the hood because it's Assassin's Creed. And I mean, they're started to phase out that silly, like, peak at the top of the hood. Assassin's Creed 4, Edward didn't have it, and Jacob doesn't have it where Evie does in Syndicate. And in fact, Jacob mostly just wears his hat. This is a really nice change. One of my favourite changes in Syndicate. And you can see the signs of this from Assassin's Creed 4. It's simple, it's really simple. It's putting on and taking off the hood, because the hood is not subtle, especially not in the middle of Victorian London. This was a similar problem in Unity. So Assassin's Creed 4, you're a pirate, you know, it's warm, maybe you put up a hood to get out of the sun. It doesn't really matter, you're a pirate, it's the least of people's concerns over there. But when you enter a restricted area, that's when Edward would put up his hood. It makes sense, you don't want to be identified, but when you're in a crowd, oh, who's that weird bloke with the hood who's crouching everywhere? And Syndicate addresses this. This is a problem in Unity. They got rid of this feature. You just constantly walked around with your blue hood in the middle of squalor and all these people in rags. And it's like, yeah, how are you blending into these crowds aside from the sheer quantity of people blocking their line of vision? This is not a clever approach. Syndicate, on the other hand, you know, Jacob has a hat because, oh, Victorian London, a lot of people around then wore hats. Fair enough, that's actually really cool. He takes off the hat and puts up his hood when you press a button, because there is a sneak button. I love this. It's brilliant. You take off the hat, put up the hood, or in Evie's case, just put up the hood, and you get a lower profile because you get lower down, which changes the line of sight. You move slightly quicker because you're in that sort of crouched moving motion. And most importantly, civilians around you go, oh, who's that? What are they doing? Oh, that looks dodgy. Oh, they're up to no good. It happens all the time because, yeah, if you were walking down the street and you saw someone acting like that, that's your first thought. So being able to choose to put on and off the hood is my favourite detail in this game, and it's the only game that does it properly. Assassin's Creed 4 comes a close second by letting you automatically put it on and off in restricted areas, but once you go to Origins and Odyssey, it's still an option, but it's an option in a menu. It's not a mechanic. It's not like you enter sneak mode and then you look like some bad cosplay from 5 years ago of an assassin. But it's steampunk because he's wearing rags and a hat. It looks silly. Assassins look silly in anything but the first game, but I don't really mind that. The problem though is the hood is not inconspicuous. It's very conspicuous. So I'm glad they addressed this. And I know I've spent a while discussing this. This is a big deal to me. I think Syndicate had the perfect approach. And in many ways, Syndicate is like, it's the natural evolution of the core Assassin's Creed gameplay. This is the gameplay that started in Assassin's Creed 1 and reached probably Revelations until Assassin's Creed 3 started to make it into a wider sort of action-adventure feeling where a lot of the systems were external to the core gameplay. You had ships, you had your homestead that you could upgrade, you could hunt creatures and then do crafting from it. And some of that is still the case even now in Syndicate, but Syndicate and Unity went back to that sort of basic, you're in the city, everything's built around you being an assassin and killing people. Syndicate is kind of like what Revelations was to Brotherhood. If Brotherhood was the sort of development of the Assassin's Creed 1-2 style, Revelations introduced the hook that means you can use zip lines. Funny that, you know, the relation there is uncanny, and also makes you climb quicker. And then it also had weird things like tower defense and little experimental, kind of unrelated mechanics to try and change things up. Unity was very much back to basics. Syndicate, with its carriage combat and its zip lines, feels like what Revelations was to Brotherhood. And I mean, if you played Revelations, you know that with 3, the reason they deviated is because the games started to blend together. Brotherhood was already quite similar to Assassin's Creed 2. Revelations was sort of exacerbating the issue because what was added either didn't massively improve things or sort of detracted from the core gameplay. Syndicate feels in a very similar way, though Syndicate is, with the hindsight of where the series has been and gone, actually quite graceful in weird ways. You know, I think the movement is still very good, even if it's not quite as good as Unity. I think combat is much better than something in like Assassin's Creed or 4 where it was way too trivial and easy. I don't really like the RPG systems, and as a result, I'm not a huge fan of where this series went afterwards, where with Odyssey, if an enemy is 1 or 2 levels above you, you just have no chance of taking them down. I think Assassin's Creed worked as an action-oriented series, action-adventure, I guess, but the problem was always that the execution was never quite there. The game was always a bit too easy. The story wasn't particularly great, with the exception of 4. I will always stand by that. I haven't played Origins of Odyssey, so I may be wrong, but it does feel... It's a bit of a shame that the last game in the City Assassin's Creed formula was so close to getting the right feel and the right thing going. I mean, I actually really like Unity. It's got some fundamental problems with storytelling and repetition. Syndicate could have been the improvement to that, but Syndicate feels good, but it isn't like the savior of the series. This is the overlooked Assassin's Creed game, even more than... well, maybe not as much as Rogue. Rogue is the overlooked Assassin's Creed game. But it's close, it's up there, and no wonder they decided to take a year off and change things up. I think it was the right decision. I still kind of hope we'll see a return to this format. Syndicate was a fun time. I mean, I always get burnt out in Assassin's Creed, and it's no different here. I got halfway and I decided to blitz the main missions and finish the game. But the presentation is still stellar, and the ideas that are there are brilliant. And in many ways, by moving to a sort of light RPG system, it's introduced new ideas that, again, aren't quite executed perfectly, but it's also dropped a lot of what made Assassin's Creed interesting in the first place. I expect that we'll see a return to this sort of older style at some point in the future, but I mean, it's been 4.5 years, and if the leaks are anything to go by, the next game's going to be another mythological Assassin's Creed like the last two. And to that, you know, I hope it's a great game. I look forward to seeing what it's like. But maybe at some point in the future, there'll be another space for a game like Syndicate, and like Unity, and like Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood, Revelations, Assassin's Creed 1, that style. I just think that maybe not enough time has passed. There's been too many that have not quite hit the mark, but if they do hit that mark, the game will be exceptional. You know, I started with paper notes, and I didn't consult them for most of this. There's definitely ground I wanted to cover, like the crew system and the liberating areas. Liberating areas is cool, but there's no emergent systems to make it interesting. It's a far cry from something like Shadow of Mordor. I mean, Austin Wintory's soundtrack is brilliant, but the songs are too short. You get these beautiful vocals in atmospheric areas, and then they just end. I feel like he needed a game, an Assassin's Creed game that took itself more seriously for its soundtrack to really, really shine, because it is incredible. It's brilliant. I really, really enjoy it. It's the best soundtrack since Assassin's Creed 4. There's a modern day story. Not even touching that. Waste of time. Oh yeah, I'm not talking about that. That's a spoiler. If you want to play the game and you haven't played it yet, that'll be a nice little pleasant surprise. A little segment about halfway through the game that they didn't talk about in marketing. Oh god, there's microtransactions.